When dealing with a falsehood, you're faced with two options. You can accept it or you can reject it. The basis upon which we take one of these actions is a product of our critical thinking capabilities and a desire to know what is true instead of confirming our bias. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. On Brainstorm, we choose the hard truths over the comforting lies. Reason, compassion, skepticism. This is the Brainstorm Podcast.
Hi, and welcome to the Brainstorm Podcast Skeptic Studio, where we do interviews, major topics, and news related to skepticism and atheism. In this interview, I talked to Rick Harp from the podcast Media Indigenous, a weekly show dedicated to covering Indigenous affairs. Rick and I haven't met before except to set up this interview, but he's someone I admire, and I think that this interview went very well. I highly recommend that anyone who's interested in learning more about Indigenous issues should definitely check out his show. With that, I'll leave you to the interview. I hope you enjoy it, despite the heavy content. Okay, Rick, welcome to the Brainstorm Skeptic Studio. I really appreciate you being here. I wanted to have you on to talk about the recent Gerald Stanley case in the Battleford area, and also just about how racial issues in Canada and how Indigenous people are often left behind.
Okay.
So first, I guess a good place to start is what are your thoughts on the Gerald Stanley case of and the verdict, the not guilty verdict of the murder of Colton Boushie?
Where does one begin?
Yeah, pretty heavy subject to start, I guess. It's I know immediately after the verdict came down, there was a slew of articles and like interviews and television and radio that talking about it. So there's a lot to absorb, but I guess, what is your take? And feel free to, I guess, rehash any points that you did on your show already.
Yeah, it's a challenge because the case has taken on significance much larger than the parties involved. It's taken on a resonance that again none of the immediate parties involved could have ever imagined, I think, in terms of what it may or may not say about the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canadians. And, you know, the defense that was undertaken was not a defense of someone trying to protect their property or the security of their person. It was a defense of accident, that the gun just went off unintentionally. And as a result, a not guilty verdict was delivered by the jury. And in other words, the evidence was taken as presented by the defense at more or less face value. And I think there are a lot of people who feel that that was a fantastical explanation of events that is nigh impossible in reality. And so our podcast discussed that. But we also, I guess, discussed the apparent inclination of an all-white jury, an apparently all-white jury, to lend credibility, to be credulous about such a fantastical argument. And what can we infer from that, because we don't have access and never will have access to the machinations of this particular jury or any jury. That's the way the Canadian justice system is set up.
Right. Yeah. So it's actually illegal now, for the jury to discuss it in any capacity, right?
Yeah, there you go. And so I know that there are reasons for that, and much of the justification seems to have a lot of weight to it and sense to it. That being the case, it leaves one wondering. It leaves one with all these questions when the evidence seems so ridiculous on the face of it that you have to work with what you've got, and there is they talk about reasonable doubt. I think there is there's reason to wonder about whether racism was a factor in this and whether it predisposed people to go to all these lengths mentally, logically, to try and find a rationale for their verdict. So, I mean, these are the kinds of questions that I know my friends and associates explore and ask and wonder about. So
it seems like there's when they had the option to come down with a manslaughter charge, it seems like every person that I've talked to that is a person who knows about guns and the handling of firearms, even if a gun goes off accidentally, still felt that he as an individual should have been held responsible for the handling of that gun. And I wonder if I wonder how a group of people can come to a conclusion that he isn't responsible for what happened with the gun that was in his hand.
Well, this was a question, I certainly wanted to look at is, where does the culpability for anything come into this picture when it comes to Gerald Stanley? It seems as if the verdict is saying he is guilty of nothing. He is responsible for nothing. He's culpable of nothing.
Right.
And
yeah,
that sounds like an outrageous statement on its face. It's as if it's as if he wasn't even there. And, there's that expression, guns don't kill people, people kill people. I guess in this case, guns kill people.
Right. Yeah.
And
I've seen that a number of times.
Right. Yeah. I must have seen the same things too. And so you're wondering, it just leaves one shaking one's head. I mean, to be honest, in some way, there's no rational way to process the outcome of events. But if you've become conditioned, as many Indigenous people are, to have low expectations of the justice system, to expect injustice rather than justice from that system.
Yeah.
The outcome, it may be shocking, but it's not necessarily surprising.
Right. Yeah. That was something that I saw across the board pretty much. I followed the week following the trial. I probably followed, I don't know, must have been a dozen or 20, Indigenous people that I hadn't been following already, who appeared to have quite a large following and might have been members of the media in some way. And they all seem to have that same idea, this is not a surprise. It's disappointing. It's frustrating. It's angering, but it's not a surprise.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, and yet it seems to have not just occurred to Indigenous people that's the case. I think it did go against, I think, people's common sense of fairness that this could not somehow have been the outcome that one would expect from the circumstances
yeah.
I mean, it's funny. I've been sort of knocked on my hind legs by the combined verdict in this case, the Gerald Stanley case, and in the verdict of the Tina Fontaine case. In other words, the Gerald Stanley trial and the Raymond Cormier trial, respectively, and you're thinking about where do things go from here, and although I suppose you could argue they're exactly where they were before these verdicts were handed down, there was a hope for different outcomes that maybe was sending a signal that things are different this time. Yeah, so it's been tough to talk about these without finding oneself kind of coming up short for words.
A while back I talked to an expert who studies implicit bias and the effects that even people who consider themselves liberal minded, where the effect of it, in where even people who think of themselves as liberal minded or progressively minded will often act in a way that leaves people of color in or various groups not getting jobs or not getting their applications considered for jobs, or they might not even get help on the side of a road in many cases. And I wonder, like, a lot of people are really quick to remove race from this as a discussion. Like, and I wonder if with knowledge of implicit bias, like, it seems so obvious to me that race has to, at some point, be part of the responsibility of the, like you say, all white jury, and they're coming down with a not guilty verdict in this case. Or in the case of Colton Boushie, for sure. I'm not sure what about the Tina Fontaine situation. I don't know that much about that one. I didn't read as much about it, I suppose. But it seems so obvious to me after learning about implicit bias that people have, unless they actively tried to not have race be part of their consideration or their attitudes about race that they've carried their whole lives, how could that not have played into this verdict?
Well, this is the challenge that I certainly come up against on an all too regular basis, is trying to map out or at least give some approximation of how larger forces, structural forces, play out in the lives of individuals. And so, right. I think one certainly can get some traction when they say, okay, Indigenous people, what are we, 5% of the overall population, maybe 10% within Saskatchewan, let's say, and yet we're 20, 25, 30, 40% of sometimes even much greater proportions of the prison population, or the population living at or below the poverty line, or, suffering disproportionately ill health outcomes or negative socio and economic indicators. And people go, that's wrong. There's got to be something at play here, at work here, that sees such a differential when it comes to these different situations, and yet making the leap from that and infusing it into one's assessment of a given trial, it just all goes by the wayside, and then it falls into these discourses around blaming the victim or bad choices, quote unquote, all this kind of stuff. And I think that's our real challenge as journalists, as people who are trying to decipher the world, make sense of it, to try and grapple with, because a lot of these conversations seem to be happening past one another, as I've heard it said, and so. Yeah, there's a real challenge before us to help people get a
Right.
concrete, practical sense of how these forces manifest themselves in day-to-day interactions.
Yeah, for sure. I one of the things I really noticed with the case of Gerald Stanley was that even like many people seem to think that they could, despite the fact that it was never a self-defense case, they could still use that as a justification in conversations with people in like online or in person. So I read an article after the fact that discussed kind of this juror who ran away from the crowd after the fact and kind of looked at it as though it was like this, like this person recognized that they were afraid of, like, whether the verdict showed that or the defense showed that or not, there was very likely a chance that fear of the First Nations person was at play in this verdict. Do you think that there's some relevance to that?
Oh, absolutely. I think fear of the other, in general, has been a tactic utilized by various societies to justify any form of incursion on the territory, resources, or personhood of another group. And I think that that's very specific to North America.
Yeah.
It at various levels of awareness and consciousness, but also, within popular culture, within education systems, enables, justifies, rationalizes the fact that where once Indigenous peoples had 100% control of this part of the world, they now have something like 0.2%.
Right.
Well, how does that happen? It typically only happens through force. And how does it maintain itself? Well, it's through force, but that can consume a lot of time, money, and energy. So maybe fear becomes kind of the initial strategy. And I mean, you have, to maybe bring it back to what we were talking about earlier. I mean, there are observers who theorize that incarceration of populations are one way to deal with them. And so fear becomes a handy way of tilling the soil, setting the stage, whatever metaphor you want to use for facilitating exactly that.
Yeah. I sometimes draw parallels when talking to people between the American system's treatment of Black people to the Canadian system's treatment of Indigenous people. And I wonder, like, they have in the past, like, I don't know if you've read The New Jim Crow.
No, I've been meaning to. It looks like a phenomenal book. I did see the documentary by Ava DuVernay on Netflix called 13, about the 13th Amendment, which, draws heavily on the analysis of the author of The New Jim Crow. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And it often, I see parallels in that sense, in that the way that a population is policed often it will result in these racial stereotype or increased incarceration rates because they're being policed more in a certain population than in another population. Like Indigenous people in Canada are often, I don't have stats in front of me to back this up, but they're often more policed than white populations or white people. And then they get incarcerated more, have higher rates of sentencing, like worse sentences for similar crimes. And then so then we end up with that higher population of Indigenous people in prisons, and then I don't know, and then I get people who who deny such a systemic racism is a thing. It's a difficult concept for some people, I guess, to get their head around.
Well, I guess one's perspective on it depends on which end of the stick one is effectively, positioned.
Right. Yeah.
And adding to that whole mix of things is the fact that I'm sure there's, when it comes to the percentages of people who oversee and work at prisons, it's probably disproportionately non-Indigenous who control those prisons that contain a population that is disproportionately Indigenous. So it's almost breathtaking in its consistency.
Yeah. And so I guess, what do you think? There's a group of men, actually, I just read the article today, who are they're going in Calgary, who are they're First Nations men in Calgary. They're standing in front of, I think, a courthouse, and they're going to be answering questions, no matter how stupid the question may be, about race relations in Calgary, or systemic racism, or whatever. So I wonder, what do you think of that? Do you think that kind of outreach should be, or is helpful, or do you think it's should it be on the job of Indigenous people to educate white people about these things?
Well, wasn't that ironically inspired by some right-wing pundit in the States who set up a table saying, "Ask me anything about feminism or change
Stephen
my mind."
Crowder.
Yeah, and so I thought maybe that was a clever reversal of something like that. I know a lot of people who bristle at the idea that in addition to struggling to put one's mind as an Indigenous person to working to undertake a response to all these challenges that we've been talking about, they also have to, in the process, set aside the time and the labor, intellectually, emotionally, and otherwise, to make white people feel less bad about themselves, or this kind of thing. And it's like, you have privileged access to books and the internet, go for it. I mean, and Indigenous people have done that labor, often not necessarily paid or maybe underpaid anyway. And I my podcast is not necessarily intended for anybody but an Indigenous audience, and those who have who aren't Indigenous but have worked hard to get a familiarity with the issues. But we at the same time, we try to be as sensitive to different levels of familiarity with certain concepts, certain aspects of Indigenous people's existence. I don't know. I think it just depends why the conversation is happening. If a non-Indigenous person wants to approach an Indigenous person with an eye towards having it go somewhere that isn't just to the benefit of that non-Indigenous person, in other words, that it isn't sort of a one-way extractive relationship, right. That changes that puts it on a different footing. And these, as you might expect, there can be some sensitivity, right, on the part of Indigenous people who frankly are going to have a whole plate full of things to work on, and it does depend on motive, I think. I haven't come across many Indigenous people who just outright reject the concept of engaging the larger population. I mean, it's going to be an absolute necessity to move forward. There's no choice but to.
Right. Yeah, I suppose.
But day to day, I think it really would depend on when, where, and why.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I wonder sometimes, like I don't think that it's right for white people to place the burden of educating them on the indigenous people. But sometimes the white people, I guess, if they're coming at it in good faith, maybe it's not as big maybe it's not a problem. I don't I don't know. I know quite often I interact probably more with black activists from the US than I do with indigenous activists in Canada, which is something I'm trying to remedy. But quite often they will say flat out, like, it's not my job to educate you, and if you want to know more, then go learn. And I think that's fair.
Well, I mean, there's lots of intellectual output and lots of thinking that takes the form of other media, visual media, audio media that can be supported and consumed and supported to actually help some of the people who are just trying to put food on the table to do so. So,
right.
I mean, when somebody's, I guess, just venturing into this territory, it can be pretty daunting to know where to start, but just keep pushing away. I mean, I guess I would selfishly promote Media Indigenous, the podcast, as a way to get into that. There's now 103 episodes to choose from. So
right.
When I know that the University of Alberta has a MOOC, is that what it's called? It's a free online course.
Oh, okay.
What is, okay, let me, you're going to edit this, right?
Sure.
What is a MOOC? It is a massive open online course. So the University of Alberta has one that's free to the public. I mean, it's a publicly funded institution. Wish we would do more of that. But I think it may or may not be undertaken through its Faculty of Native Studies. And I've been hearing nothing but great things about that, and it's doing well. So, and then there's the library.
I saw that there actually you promoted, or maybe it was one of your guests a couple episodes ago, promoted a book called Seeing Red that I've recently just purchased that I'm looking forward to reading. Yeah,
that was Candace Collison. She's a professor at UBC in journalism, and that's a historic look back at how media have framed Indigenous people and their issues when they cover them, and it's same old. It's amazing how much has not really changed. It may have a different face in some ways, but in a lot of ways, the fundamental white gaze, as some academics call it, seems to remain the same.
Yeah, that makes sense. Back into the context of the current cases that were in court, the way that the media often framed it was very much victim blaming and like kind of almost anything to avoid responsibility for the white man who's on trial. So, yeah. Something I'm interested in that I've been trying to watch Pam Palmater videos.
Pam Palmater, yeah.
Yeah, and she is not a fan of the Liberal government. So I wonder what are your thoughts on the Liberal government, or like, if moving forward, what would you like to see out of that in terms of Indigenous affairs?
You're full of big questions today.
Yeah.
That's a podcast in and of itself. I mean,
it really is, isn't it?
I mean, our position as critics, as journalists, as academics, as observers is I think to show neither fear nor favor to any government. So anything I might say is not particular to the Liberal government. I think Trudeau's election campaign made a lot of promises to Indigenous people. Some of it was sort of deliberately opaque and fuzzy. And as things started to clear up, it became also clear that a lot of what the Liberals were prepared to do didn't look all that much different in substance compared to the Harper regime in terms of respecting.
Is that right?
In terms of respecting free, prior, and informed consent. It's interesting, right? Consent has, because of the Me Too campaign, if you will, become front and center in a lot of people's minds. Consent is a concept that's also been quite active within the Indigenous community too, when it comes to decision making, having a say over what happens in your territory with your resources.
Right.
And Canada has asserted for itself a superior claim and a superior right to make that decision. It's not even willing to entertain a shared decision. And I mean, this is a relationship that's a very special one that emerged thanks to the arrival of outsiders from way over on the other side of the water to this part of the world. And there was an openness to the idea that, well, there's plenty of land, there's plenty of prosperity here for everybody. Why don't we look at seeing if we can share it and to everyone's benefit? And instead, that somehow become, well, we make the rules here, and we'll do our best to accommodate you as a kind of quote unquote special interest group, as a kind of ethnic population. That seems to be the attitude. But it's clearly we're not interested, if I may speak on behalf of all the Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast here, in that type of scenario where our rights are subordinate. At the very least, they're equal and should be treated as such. Now, some people call that a naive, impolitic attempt to enforce a veto, but it's just we don't tell Spain what to do. And here in Canada, so why wouldn't the same type of principles apply? Unless your nation-to-nation rhetoric is rather hollow at its core.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like rather than speaking from nation to nation, it's you're a group of people we have control over, and that's that. It's yeah.
I mean, some people even reduce it even further down to there's more of us than you, and, we're going to decide what's in the public interest, which is what the majority of people want, as determined by us. So, yeah. I'm not really sure where to go with from there. That's actually like the attitude that I've seen is almost more. It's by many people very troubling. It's very much like, so what? Like you gotta. Rather than dealing with the issue of a nation to nation conversation, they like to list off all the supposed benefits that Indigenous people get because of the government handouts, they call it, or whatever. And it's frustrating. And I can't even imagine how frustrating it must be to be on the receiving end of that kind of rhetoric. Yeah, well, I mean, Indigenous people want to have a say in what happens to their lands, to their resources, to their territories, to their children. They want to have the levers and mechanisms that come with true jurisdiction that isn't delegated and isn't just, handed down at the pleasure of the government of the day. You see what's going on in the contest between British Columbia and Alberta over whether or not bitumen is going to flow from the one province through the lands of the other. First Nations are looking for at least that much jurisdiction and respect, grudging or otherwise, for their capacity to decide what goes on in their borders. And it's no more complicated than that. And yet somehow there seems to be all these, legal, intellectual acrobatics that the larger settler society engages in to justify a situation that, where the roles reversed would be seen as absolutely untenable, maybe even grounds for declaring war. I mean,
right, yeah.
Yeah. Colonialism has set up a really funny state of affairs that is all the more remarkable for its normalization.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I'm struggling to think of a person because I'm just a regular blue collar guy who's trying to get as much information as I can and learn these things on my own. But I work in an industry like the oil field industry, and I'm pretty much the only person there that would even really discuss, like, who would even understand the word colonialism. So it's such an uphill battle to even get it understood that the reversal of it or the work towards repairing issues seems quite daunting, I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know where to begin with formulating a strategy for that. I mean, I suppose one way to look at it is people have the luxury of ignorance and the privilege of innocence when it comes to these things, if depending on which side of the ledger they are. So
yeah.
I think though that depending on what we're talking about, that people can sympathize, empathize with inequitable treatment of Indigenous people. I think where it really gets challenging is trying to undertake solutions, because much has been tried within the current arrangement, but I think that ultimately it does come back to, different types of restoring jurisdiction, restoring land, restitution, reparation, these kinds of concepts that will, I think, in the end, make the relationship stronger, will make everybody better off.
Right.
But it's when you go from 100% to 0.02%, that actually may be, I think I said 0.2%. It actually may be 0.02. It does become odd to hear people talk about, well, what are we going to do? Give all the land back? It's like, why don't we start with 1%?
Maybe you could start somewhere.
Because quite often, as Indigenous economies, and we're seeing this in quite robustly in different pockets across Canada, as Indigenous economies do start to strengthen and solidify, quite often they're looking to purchase goods made outside of the community. I mean, that happens right now. But even when they start to have their own internal economies, they're not silos. It's not autarky. It's going to be an integrated, mutually beneficial playing out here of those trends. So
right.
I don't know. Maybe it's just that fighting back, pushing back, going to courts, litigation, political battles. These have been the kinds of gestures and tactics that wake the larger society up, and so it's hard, I think, not to want to keep doing that as a way of moving forward. But I think we're going to get to a point where we do have to be more about negotiation and about working out a new relationship that harkens back to the original ones that saw these distinct peoples sign treaties.
Right.
We need to renew those treaties, not, wait for the Trudeau government or the Harper government or any government to, decide when they want to be generous with us.
Right.
The relationship has to be bilateral, or I should say multilateral, because there are, there's 600, reserves in Canada, but
Right.
these reserves all fit under different cultural umbrellas, whether that's the Cree umbrella or the Anishinaabe umbrella or the Haida umbrella or the Mohawk umbrella. Like, these are just like a province is made up of a number of constituent pieces, so are larger Indigenous nations, if you will. So,
Right.
of which there are, estimates vary, but 60, right? So you think Canada has a lot of provinces and territories. I think that's what, most people actually, again, bringing this all back in a loop, right? I think most people would be surprised to know that there isn't just one Indigenous language. And that, if you took somebody who spoke only Haida from the West Coast and you plopped them in a room with someone who only spoke Mi'kmaq from the East Coast, they would have no idea what the other person was saying, right?
Right.
So
that makes sense.
How did that all get compressed? How did that all get erased? How did that all get marginalized over the span of some centuries? It happened through force, and so it's no wonder people, when they hear me speak English, or most Indigenous people, not that we had a choice, think that there's no meaningful difference between Indigenous peoples across what is now called Canada.
Yeah, it seems like a tough problem to solve. Yeah.
Well,
I'm
I mean,
kind of at a loss. It's
well, I mean, we're this week's podcast, which is in the works. I mean, people talked about, or was it last week? Anyway, there was discussion about the concept that quite often when we approach Indigenous subject matter, it's always through the lens of deficits, right? Deficiencies, gaps, and I don't know. Maybe if we flip that on its head, I mean, not in a kind of disingenuous, airy-fairy way, but looked at Indigenous strengths, looked at Indigenous assets, looked at Indigenous people through that prism.
Right.
Maybe we'd get a lot further ahead. I'm not saying it's some magical key, but all too often we fall back on what the early Indian Affairs bureaucrats would call the Indian problem. And I think we have to just resist that at every turn.
Right.
So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Do you think, I wonder, like, the issue seems so complex here in Canada. Are there parallels to the U.S.? I have a pretty decent listening audience in the U.S. So are there similar issues in the U.S. for Indigenous people?
Oh, well, I mean, it just depends whether you're 30,000 feet or 1,000 feet. I think from 30,000 feet, absolutely. I mean, both Canada and the United States actively work to dispossess
Right.
Indigenous peoples. And whereas perhaps in the one case in the United States, the annihilation was a stated upfront purpose. I think
Right.
for Canada it was absorption. Although I think no one was dissatisfied when annihilation was a byproduct as well. So, I'm not someone who I would rely on for intricate history of government policy, but I would say that for all intents and purposes, the goals were the same. I mean, you see it in Australia, you see it in New Zealand, you see it in the United States, and you see it in Canada. Well, I mean, those are Anglo-American countries. I think at a larger mission level, understanding that they all wanted to take the lands and the resources and the spoils in order to feed a rapidly expanding capitalist-oriented economy, global economy.
Right. Yeah.
And we were in the way. And you know, where they had to deal with us, nation to nation, they did so until they didn't have to do so.
Right.
I mean, disease played a big part in thinning out the ranks of Indigenous populations, making it much less challenging to have to deal with them.
Yeah. It's a pretty heavy subject, I suppose. It's something that
doesn't get heavier than that.
No way.
Well, I mean, it's core to what Canada is and has become, and
yeah,
it cannot be. It, you know, Trudeau recently came up with some framework. He's not the first and won't be the last, I'm sure, to present some initiative of his as if it was some sweeping new thing. It's different this time. And
right.
Said something to the effect of, well, we can't change the past or something like that. We can't undo the hurts that have already transpired. And it's, we're not talking about feelings. We're talking about land, control of land. We're talking
right.
about resourcing in every sense of the word, political power. And
yeah,
it's funny. In some ways, it seems so straightforward. You scratch your head going, why is this not resonating? Why is this not getting anywhere? Are we too simplistic? No, we can't be. I mean, so, it's
what's going on?
I think for reconciliation, quote unquote, to happen, I mean, when the scales have been tipped so much to the side, to one side, to right that situation, there has to be, I prefer to use the term reckoning rather than reconciliation. There has to be an accounting. There has to be some physical redistribution for reconciliation to take place. And so when all the chips have moved over to one side, well, that means to right things, some of those chips have to go back. And, there's an expression, I'm sure I'm going to bung this up, but it's something like, when you're so used to privilege, when you've grown up with privilege, equity is going to seem like oppression.
Yeah. Which you see a lot of these days with the, it's okay to be white stuff and white nationalists.
When has it not been
streets.
Okay to be white?
Yeah, exactly. It's always been okay to be white. They want to believe that they're victims now because people want equality.
Well, I mean, I think within significant portions of the white population, they are victims of an absolutely horrible economic system known as capitalism that has seen an increasing concentration of power, and so. People are afraid that they want answers, and along comes a demagogue who seems to be speaking their language, or at least speaking to their circumstances, in a way that Obama did not, in a way that Clinton did not, in a way that other parts of the Republican Party did not. In that way, Trump and Trudeau are the same. I mean, they're saying what you want to hear,
right?
But the status quo marches merrily on. So, but, it's okay to be white, but apparently it's not okay to not be the 1%. And, and there, I think, I guess First Nations people would say, welcome to the club.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. It's funny that we kind of got onto capitalism a little bit because more and more my podcast and the conversations I've had have been a little bit more socialist, a little bit more communist, a little bit at least anti-capitalism in a sense. It's just one of these things that keeps coming up because it's such a root problem when you have a system that's built on exploitation.
Absolutely. Exploitation, and we see these growing trends towards automation. I mean, I think capitalism is, as they say, collapsing in on its own contradictions. I mean, to make lots of money, you need as cheap inputs as possible, and human inputs are the most expensive. But of course, you're ultimately sabotaging your own market, right? I mean, every dollar spent is somebody else's income, as I've heard it said.
Yeah,
and
that's
so who's going to buy these products? And I mean, I think capitalism's solution was to expand all over the globe, right? But I mean, now it's come up against the limits of that particular historical strategy. And I don't know. It's interesting, right? Because I think there's what we've seen is there's sort of two broad containers of outlook on the world. And I think there are people who divide the world into the deserving and the undeserving, right? And somehow those who are rich deserve to be so, and vice versa. And I think there's another way to look at it, and that is there's two camps. There's the fortunate and the unfortunate. What I like about using the term fortune is because there's a lot of luck involved.
Yeah.
I think we talk about self-made people as if it's a legitimate concept, when I think interdependence is an absolute human condition, and the only way to foster that is to foster a society that is social in its outlook, in terms of, no person exists without a community underneath them. And I mean, I guess you could call that socialist and communist, but capitalism is about pitting person against person. It's competitive. It's individualistic, and it's an inherently self-destructive, almost cancerous approach to the world.
Yeah. No, I you got me. I just interviewed a guy just before you and I connected, and he talks about things in terms of collectivization of things, and as well as like not just even products and resources, but also like our social ideas also are collectivized, like, and need to be collectivized, because this individualism or this pitting each other against each other is creating almost individual realities where we don't really acknowledge what's actually a fact or a true, because we don't want to. So,
well, most of the prosperity we enjoy today is the result of the state investing in research and development, R&D that no private corporation would touch. Talking about things like pharmaceuticals, talking about things like the internet, talking about things like all the basic components of any electronic device, iPhone or otherwise, that we all enjoy, all of which was made possible through state investment. And where is that state dividend? It's not there. I mean, there's an expression, socialize the risk, privatize the gain. And I think that's been, if you really look at what's the economic history. I mean, it's funny, right? We talk about economics as if it's math, and really we should be looking at it through a historic lens, through actual events, not the theory, the pure theory that everyone just scratches their head at and goes like, these are fairy tales.
Right. Yeah.
And so, that is as similarly daunting a prospect to try and get out there into the general populace, as trying to convince them that they live in a colonial society.
Yeah, it becomes, well, very much still people are responding to the Red Scare back in the whatever it was, 50s and 60s, that the idea, even the word socialism now still isn't something that you can communicate with people about.
Well, I mean, the Sanders campaign seemed to have definitely socialist aspects to it in terms of its platform. So crazy things like free education and, trying to change a society goes beyond more than one person's lifetime.
Yeah, that's true.
And the future's not set in stone. Absolutely. I mean, it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, by saying who knows what's going to happen, that can fill one with existential dread. But on the other hand, I think it could also suggest that it's open. It's open to influence, and we just have to shed, I think, this limited thinking about how our economic life and how that structures decisions about what gets made and who enjoys the spoils of it. And Indigenous people have a lot to contribute to that conversation. I mean, I say this extremely facetiously, but sometimes I think maybe the answer is some sort of reverse assimilation. We just win over the larger population to our way of thinking. I mean, I think there's been a lot of back and forth influence, not always in a good way, obviously, but despite all odds, our populations are growing in some parts of the country, and our footprint is being definitely felt in some predominantly non-Indigenous regions, cities, and metropolitan areas, and so. But at the same time, we're instantly reminded every time there's the outcome of murder trials that our populations remain disproportionately vulnerable too.
Yeah. Well, it seems like a heavy point to leave it on, but I don't know if there would have been a less heavy point to leave it on. I really appreciate you coming and talking to me about this stuff. I don't know that we covered everything that I would have liked to cover, but at the same time, we covered a lot of stuff. So
like I say, I'm on episode 103, and it just feels like things are only getting started.
Right.
So if we can't do it, I mean, how many hours does that represent? I mean, each episode is about an hour, so.
Right, yeah. And then plus the work put into it.
Yeah, let's not talk about that.
Yeah, that's right. So where can people find your stuff?
Well, if they Google Media Indigena, INDIGENA, and podcast, that's one way to do it. I mean, if you're listening right now, that means you listen to podcasts. So you can find us in every single corner of the podcast world. We just added our podcast to Spotify. So very happy about that. We're, of course, on iTunes and Stitcher and Overcast and the like. There's a website, mediaindigena.com. You can also learn how to support us there. We have a Patreon, which continues to go merrily along.
That's great. I really appreciate your work. I'm like I say, I confess ignorance to many of the issues facing Indigenous people in Canada right now, but I'm working on learning about them. And I appreciate your time, and I appreciate your show quite a bit.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Okay, so that's it for the interview. I want to thank Rick for joining me and for the great conversation. I know not everyone will agree, and that's fine, but I really appreciate that these conversations often end up pointing at issues in capitalism, because I do agree that that's the cause of much of the inequality we see. I'm not going to say much more about that right now. you'll hear other interviews and discussions that point in that direction and have more content to them. I've got a ton of stuff coming out. I'm going to do a short episode on some recent sexual harassment and misconduct allegations that involve friends of the show, former friends, and some bigger names in the atheist and skeptic community, as well as an interview I did with Joshua Richards of the JRR Talking podcast, as well as an interview with Peter Coffin about his new book. And I have an episode of Skeptic Voices coming out with Ian Bushfield. So there's tons of content coming your way. For anything else, you can get a hold of me at mail@brainstormblog.net. You can check out the show notes at thebrainstormpodcast.com and sometimes our website, brainstormblog.net. Thanks to our financial supporters, the Utah Outcasts, Bassett, Will, Aaron, Daryl, Destin Sucks, Lachlan, Lisa, Magnus, Michael, Positively Skeptical, Rob, and Stephanie. If you want to join them and help the show grow, then you can do that at patreon.com/brainstormpodcast. I want to thank Rick again for joining me, and you can find his stuff at mediaindigena.com. That link will be in the show notes on thebrainstormpodcast.com and eventually on brainstormblog.net. You can also support us by donating to our GoFundMe for the conference. GoFundMe.com/shift-2-reason-conference-2018. We are over $1,000 and we'll start booking things soon. Or you can go and buy some stuff at tpublic.com/stores/brainstorm-podcast-gear. They have much better shipping prices than other online stores, and they're a great place for you to get your Brainstorm gear. Thanks, Dave, for our intro music. Thanks to Aaron Rabbi for doing the new intro voiceover. Thanks to Alex Capper-Murdoch for doing the voiceover for our ads. And thanks to Jason Camo for our outro music. All music played is either with permission or under the SOCAN license to play. For more information on SOCAN, you can check out the music license info page on our website, brainstormblog.net. Remember to give us a rating, a thumbs up, or a fave on your podcatcher of choice. Join our Facebook group, like our page, follow us on Twitter, share the show, and spread the word. Thanks for listening, and remember, the truth matters.
This is an opinion-based podcast. Each person on the podcast is responsible for their own opinions, and those opinions don't necessarily reflect the views of the rest of the panel. Any guests or anyone associated with the people on the podcast, such as spouses, partners, children, other family members, friends, or employers. No one person speaks for the podcast with the possible exception of Corey, and he doesn't speak for anyone else on the show. The Brainstorm podcast does not represent the views of our sponsors.
We just wanted to say thanks to everyone who listens to us, shares the show, gives us a rating on iTunes or Stitcher, or supports us through Patreon and Gumroad. We don't have a lot of interactions with our listeners, but what we have had proves that we attract some of the best people around. Smart, kind, and cool. An audience truly worthy of the titles hardcore and woo-free. Thanks for helping us make the world a smarter place.